everyone. This is Dee Marley with the History Bards podcast. Today we have the great privilege of inviting Cecelia Tichi to the show today with her Gilded Age novels. Cecelia is a native of Steel City, Pittsburgh, and is an award-winning author and faculty member at Vanderbilt University. Her books span American literature and culture from colonial days to modern times, but recently draw upon the Gilded Age, which I am fascinated to talk to her about, because these prompted her book on Jack London and another on 7 activists in that tumultuous era. So we would love to know a little bit more about you. So tell the listeners about you and your books.
Well, it's true. I come from Steel City, as it was, and the remnants are the Pittsburgh Steelers, because no steel is made there. But of course, it's Andrew Carnegie's bailiwick. So much of the wealth of America, we ought to realize the Gilded Age was the term that Mark Twain and his co-author, Charles Dudley Warner, pronounced in their 1873 novel. But otherwise, the era has been called the age of steel and steam, the age of enterprise, and the age of big business.
Right.
So these terms were kind of competing with each other. But the reason I say that Mark Twain, and most people have forgotten his co-author, most of the people who realize that Gilded Age is the best title understand that the glitter is shiny and golden and wonderful, but that underneath it, the base metal calls attention to itself. So we have a whole cast and class of characters right from the mansions in Newport, Rhode Island, and we are so fortunate that those are still standing and available for touring. It's really wonderful because those in New York City have largely been replaced. Yeah. I mean, this is the country that prides itself on the future and not the past. But down to those who were laying the bricks and scrubbing the floors, and in Pittsburgh, walking those girders over the boiling cauldrons of mixed metals. So it's a tumultuous period, as I said, Dee, and as you know, and it's ripe for fiction. My fiction.
Yes, it absolutely is. And one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated with that era, anyway, I don't live that far from Jekyll Island, where, a lot of those millionaires of that Gilded Age spent a lot of their vacation time there. And so some of their houses are still there, and the hotel that they built is still there. So a lot of that history I'm just really fascinated with. One of my favorite books of all time is The Great Gatsby. And so, so I really want to know, let's tell the listeners about the premise behind your books.
Okay, first of all, as you pointed out, I had done a lot of nonfiction writing about that period. And so, as with any historical novelist, you've got to immerse yourself in the period before you start fictionalizing it. I draw upon a couple. He, a Knickerbocker East Coast gentleman, 5th generation New Yorker. His name is Roderick DeVere, and he's been to law school, as many of the gentlemen were. They weren't practicing law necessarily, but my character, Roddy, is a practicing lawyer. Here's what he does. He defends the taverns and saloons from the temperance ladies who are determined to shut down all alcoholic beverages. And on the side, he is a master mixologist because as a young guy, his parents would send him to the P.T. Barnum Museum in Lower Broadway. He found it very boring to look at elephants' tusks. And he went down the street where he found another invention of the Gilded Age. We can think gears and girders and steel, but another invention was the cocktail, the mixed drink is an invention before the Gilded Age. It was straight whiskey, only for the men, and any dilution, be it ice or water or fruit juice, that was weakening and that was robbing the drinker of the purity. Anyway, so he becomes a cocktail maestro, secretly consulting to ocean liners and railroads and resorts, always secretly, because after all, he is a New York gentleman. That's who he is. But his rich parents were on the brink of bankruptcy from bad investments, and they went to Nevada, to Virginia City, the silver bonanza capital of America. And young Roderick met Valentine Mackle de Vere, a silver heiress, the daughter of, in fact, a silver mogul. I based her on her papa, John Mackay, who was at one point the richest man in America, along with J.P. Morgan. I based Valentine, so I made John Mackay her papa, and she is based on Evelyn Walsh McLean, whose papa struck gold in Colorado and became enormously rich and moved her to the East Coast. Here's why, Dee. I really am bonded with Val, with Evelyn. She never forgot where she came from. She grew up in the mining camps of Colorado with her father. She remembered sleeping under a bearskin rug in sub-zero temperatures in the winter. So she said, I sleep on satin sheets now, but I remember those bearskin rugs in the mining camps. So that's who she is. And in fact, when she and her husband were in Newport, along with Mrs. Astor and all the other wealthy East Coasters mostly, but also those who had come and become kings of, say, tin or kings of corn, made great fortunes. They built their mansions in Newport. It was Evelyn McLean who knew the names of all her staff of 30 and more servants.
Wow.
The others didn't bother to learn those names. So my Val, and her Roderick Roddy, they marry, and she finds herself in a new life, corseted, a lady. She's never quite accepted because of who she is, a Western gal, some sort of an Annie Oakley. They can't ignore her because she's too rich. So she brings the money, and it's a love match. And Dee, the first novel in the series, A Gilded Death, it begins in Newport when Val and Roddy are trying to protect a good friend whose life is in danger of a murderer who got the first great aunt deceased and the next in line also dead, and that poisoner is coming after their friend, and they need to figure out who it is to save their friend. After that, in the autumn, women are being murdered in Central Park, practically across the street from their Fifth Avenue house in that case too. And then it goes from there. Winter at the Metropolitan Opera when there's a murder in the next box. But Val is suspected. Her earring was found in that box. Could she be implicated in that death? Now, Val, I could go on, but you probably want to ask me a question.
It's completely okay because that's one of the things I love is in interviewing authors is when you see the passion behind what you're writing, it really motivates people to want to read it because it's as historical authors, we know that we have to immerse ourselves so much into the history, into the research, and to see that it's like a fire that you have about the era, and it really, it spurs somebody to think, oh, you know what, I really need to read these.
Hey, and if you Google Gilded Age, you get as many references to our own current age,
Yes,
that we are in a second Gilded Age. So if we think vast wealth disparities,
yes,
major technological change. At that time, the internal combustion engine was replacing the buggy whip, in
yes,
a sense. And now, of course, the digital world that we're still trying to cope with.
we are.
So there's a connection between the first Gilded Age and our own second.
Yes,
So
and I'm
yeah.
glad you brought that up because I kind of wanted to talk about that because I'm amazed that you brought that up because I was thinking about that, about how that era compares to our day today, and how the changes that they went through, going from the conformity of the Victorian era through that whole transformation. You kind of, I know a lot of people are like fans of Downton Abbey, but you can
Mhm.
see like the transformation through the years and through that era, and how everything changed so much. And so I'm glad you brought that up about the transformations we're going through now. It's
Right, and the TV, the HBO series, The Gilded Age,
yes,
starting in the 1880s, and it too, if the seasons can get renewed, once again we might move into the age of the horseless carriage,
yes,
and all of that toward mostly um, the Chronicle of the Gilded Age, you know this, takes us from the post Civil War years, from about 1865 into World War One,
right,
1914. So those are the decades that are usually considered
yes,
now to
yes.
be the Gilded Age. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So I have to ask you, so in talking about all this, because I know one of the whenever I was looking over your brief and everything, one of the books that you wrote, What Would Miss Astor Do?
Yes.
A complete
Yes.
guide to manners and morals of the or mores of the Gilded Age. So tell us about that, because as historical authors, we're all the time looking for research. So I think this would be a fascinating book for anybody who's wanting to do research about this era. So tell us about it.
Well, that's interesting because just the other day, someone emailed me and said, "My wife's doing some research and she just found your Mrs. Astor book and she's in it." Here's how that came about. I had been writing about call it the not the bottom feeders, but the lower parts. Jack London is a major Gilded Age writer, and he needs more credit.
Yes.
Um, I will tell you, my literary agent, Deirdre Mullane, called me up and said, "You are the client who can do this. There needs to be a book about Mrs. Astor and that period. What did they wear? What did they eat? Where did they go? How did they go there? Who were their friends?" And on and on. You can do this. Think about it. Well, it didn't take me 10 minutes.
Right.
And that was, and I've been looking as well for the sort of book that my students at Vanderbilt University would say to me, "Can we read some excerpts?" Now, this is a hot stove question because most of us in the classroom would say, "Absolutely not. You need the whole story. You need to go from page one to the end." But I began to think about the sort of book that could be dipped into, that a person could look at the table of contents and say, "Oh, here's what they were drinking. And oh, here's where they went on the off seasons between winter in New York and summer in Newport. What were they doing? Oh, being fitted for gowns at the Worth Studios in Paris,
Yeah.
or shooting pheasants in Scotland in the fall." So it's that sort of book. Altogether, it kind of compiles behavior, tastes, um, and where really, where did people go? Oh, and think about the elevator. I mean, we take it for granted. It turns out there was a young Vermonter named Otis. Do I say any more? We look down at those plates in an elevator, and there is his name.
Yeah.
What he was able to invent was a brake for the hoist. Hoists, I looked this up, were as old as the Colosseum in Rome,
Wow.
but they tended to slip and plummet to the ground.
Yeah.
Mr. Otis invented the hoist with a braking unit, and there
Wow.
was the elevator, and that enabled the tall buildings,
Yeah.
soon called skyscrapers and cloud pressers,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Of course, it's Edison who's the marquee name for electricity. But
Yeah.
when we start to think of others who completely transformed life, so my Mrs. Astor book has to reach in to the Mr. Otises and explain how they too were an important part. And let's remember, if one tours, and if you go to Newport this summer, you might ask to take the elevator instead of the stairs,
Yeah.
and you will see the private elevators, some installed at the time the mansions were built in the 1880s, 90s. But there's one that came from the Ritz Hotel in Paris in 1905,
Wow.
and you could ride that elevator. And those elevators had upholstered benches for ladies to sit down as they ascended and descended. So it became a lot of fun to do the research, and I think this is true of all of us who wade into history. After you've been in it for a while and you're embarking on a new book, such as What Would Mrs. Astor Do? For me, I had to ask, as anyone does, what do I know and what do I need to know?
Yeah.
And this is true in my novels as well, my Gilded Age series novels. Um, I am speaking to you from my study, surrounded by about 2,000 books on the period. So if memory doesn't quite do it, I just reach over to the shelf and there it is, my
Yeah.
fellow authors stand by me. And so that's the story. And my agent, Deirdre Mullane, was very pleased. And I will say, if any author thinking of possible publishers, don't forget this, the academic university press publishers. New
Thank you.
York University Press
Yes.
did a wonderful job. And I said, could I have a book with one of those ribbon bookmarks? Oh yes, and so it is, and it is the handsomest job, and it has sold and is selling very well. So it's still there for fans, and of course the history of Mrs. Astor. There were other Mrs. Astors. There was a Mrs. William Waldorf Astor, cousins who disliked each other tremendously. The the uh, the Astoria Waldorf, the hotel, linked hotel. One cousin built one, the Astoria, the other one built the Waldorf, and only because the profits would accrue better if the hotels hitched themselves together did those warring cousins agree to join the two for the Waldorf Astoria.
Yeah.
But Mrs. Astor, the Mrs. Astor, was Carolyn Schermerhorn from the Dutch ancestry that thought of itself as the highest caste. Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor, Mrs. William Back Backhouse. She asked him to delete that name. It sounded a little too much like a privy. Backhouse. Um, William B. Astor
Okay.
Jr. And so that's who she was.
Okay.
And she became, of course, the reigning queen of society.
Yeah.
And Dee, just to say, I have been asked who would be the Mrs. Astor today?
Oh,
But the answer is the queens of the Gilded Age today would be corporate leaders.
yeah,
The high-ranking executive positions that were out of the question in that Gilded Age, even though there's the glass ceiling, there are women. Think of Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors today. And she started on the shop floor right out of high school in a
yeah,
training program at GM. But there can be social leaders, but there cannot be a social queen today. There are too many other career opportunities
right.
that have opened to us.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's exactly right. They definitely didn't have that. They had the social, but they didn't have that back then.
right,
So
right.
another sign of change in our world today. And well, the next thing that I kind of wanted to get into just a little bit because we don't have very much time, and I would love
Okay.
to post this on the screen for everybody. So I see that in your books because you mentioned earlier about him being a mixologist. So let's
Mm-hmm.
talk a little bit about cocktails. So favorite
Mm,
cocktails of the
mm.
era. Maybe we could share one on the screen, like one of your favorites or something from the book. And for some,
I may
whoever wants
open
to
up that.
try it while they're reading one of your books.
Oh boy. Well, let me just go back into that era,
Sure.
and think of who was the leading maestro of the bar, a man named Jerry Thomas, um, who realized, as a few other bartenders were realizing, the addition of ice was pleasing.
Yeah.
That was the first mixed drink. Uh, Ice chiming against the glass in a whiskey drink. From there, Jerry Thomas, and he tended bar down the street from that Barnum Museum, and then in San Francisco as well, sometimes in the UK, and then a bit in Virginia City, Nevada, that silver capital. He published a book with 10 cocktails, and those were mostly very call them skeletal, just a whiskey or gin with just a tiny bit of vermouth maybe, and
Mhm.
ice and an olive. I think the triumph, though others think it was the Manhattan
I was
from
fixing to say the
Hoffman,
Manhattan.
from the and the Hoffman House Hotel in New York, the Men's Cafe claims in the invention of the Manhattan. But my favorite is the old fashioned.
Okay.
Um, and and there it is. Rye whiskey for the purists. I would prefer bourbon. Um, a teaspoon of simple syrup, a an orange peel twisted so that that citrus oil disperses, um, and and two dashes of orange bitters, and ready for this,
Okay.
an authentic maraschino cherry, not one of those red dyed jobs. That is not the maraschino. And in
Right.
fact, the maraschino originated in Croatia,
Oh,
but most of them come from Italy now. And a jar of maraschinos may cost you more than your favorite fifth of bourbon or rye. But what a difference it makes.
yes.
And so that is my favorite. But the martinis, the Negronis, the and whiskey drinks and gin drinks began to be named for celebrities
Yeah.
of the period. One, 1898, Admiral George Dewey conquers the Spanish fleet in the Manila Harbor in the Spanish American War. And lo and behold, there is a Dewey cocktail. Um, And for Commodore Vanderbilt University, and since I taught at Vanderbilt University, I feel I have some possessive claim.
Yes.
Here is something that I learned too late to get into my book. So for the first time, it's on this podcast.
All right. Yay.
Okay. Commodore Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt, he made his fortune in shipping by sea. First, a couple of sailing barges, really, from Staten Island, where his mama had a farm, and he borrowed money from her to buy these boats, and he sailed them with vegetables to Manhattan. And then he had sailing boats, and then steamships, and then railroads. It turns out that he was a fan of fast trotting horses, and he went to Saratoga in 1872, before the great inventive period of cocktails. He, while driving his trotters, racing them at Saratoga, he sipped gin that was sugared.
Wow.
He diluted the gin with sugar. He sweetened it. That was the first idea of the cocktail. The gin or whiskey that in some way was mixed with something else to give it a better taste. Commodore Vanderbilt should be credited with one of the first invented cocktails, gin with sugar.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's like I said before, your passion behind what you're doing is clearly evident, and we appreciate it so much. And I know your fans are appreciate the passion and research that you put behind your books. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Dee, it's been a pleasure, and thank you. How cheerful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Well, to everybody listening, thank you so much for being on the show today, for listening. Please be sure to go out and learn more about Cecelia and her books at her website, and we're going to post that on the screen. And be sure and stay tuned for our next episodes coming up next week. And to all those listening, again, thank you. This is Dee Marley at the History Bards Podcast. Keep making history and keep listening.